Welcome to the next lecture for U.S. History. Today I want to talk about politics during the decade of the 1960s and the second phase of the Civil Rights Movement. It's important to understand a few important concepts to be addressed in this lecture. First, we'll explore some issues associated with John Kennedy, including the style of governing he brought to the White House, and issues associated with his domestic and foreign policies. We'll also discuss Lyndon Johnson and contrast his governing style and accomplishments with those of John Kennedy's. Finally, we'll return to the issues of civil rights and discuss the so-called second phase of the Civil Rights Movement. I'd like to begin by discussing the election of 1960 and the unique style John Kennedy brought to the White House. There were two major candidates in the election of 1960. John Kennedy was the first. Kennedy had served in the Navy during the Second World War, and shortly after he had returned, he won a seat in the House of Representatives. By 1960, he was a senator from Massachusetts. He was very young, just 42 years old in 1960. He was also Roman Catholic. The American people had never elected a Catholic to the presidency. The second candidate was Richard Nixon, a Republican from California. He was well known to the American people because he had served for 8 years as vice president under the very popular Dwight Eisenhower. During and before his time as vice president, he had a reputation as a strong anti-communist. This reputation was initially earned when, as a member of the House on Un-American Activities Committee, he accused former State Department official Alger Hiss of espionage. Following intense questioning from then Congressman Nixon, Hiss's actions were discovered, and he was later convicted of perjury. A series of televised debates probably made the difference between the two candidates in what would be the closest election since the 1880s. In the first debate, Nixon was sick, he had a poor makeup job, and was visibly sweating. By contrast, Kennedy was tan and calm. He seemed to speak directly to the American people as he looked into the camera and explained what he would do if he were elected president. In the end, Kennedy won by a mere 120,000 votes out of a total of 70 million votes cast. On the left, we see an electoral map from that 1960 election. Below, there's a hyperlink providing more information on the debate. Once elected, Kennedy brought a unique brand or style to the White House which was in direct contrast to that of Dwight Eisenhower. Ike was like everyone's grandfather. Kennedy was young and handsome. He had a beautiful wife, and for the first time in decades, young children were living at the White House. They even played touch football on the White House lawn. Kennedy was also a very eloquent speaker, and surrounded himself with what one author described as the best and the brightest intellectuals from across the nation. Like Franklin Roosevelt before him, Kennedy effectively used the media, this time it was television, to his political advantage. Now we can investigate some of the policy positions John Kennedy brought to his administration. We see a variety of policy successes Kennedy was able to push through Congress early in his administration. First of all, he was able to convince Congress to increase the defense budget by about 20%. Secondly, he sponsored the creation of a brand new military group specializing in guerrilla warfare. The name of this group was the Green Beret. Another pet project was created in 1961. This was the Peace Corps. And Kennedy received support for the space program with the goal of placing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. While we see some successes with these individual programs here, the core of Kennedy's domestic policy was labeled the New Frontier. In what was clearly in the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and Harry Truman's Fair Deal, John Kennedy announced his New Frontier, which had many lofty goals. First of all, he wanted to fight poverty. Secondly, he wanted to provide federal aid to public education. He also supported a healthcare system for the elderly. Last, he wanted to protect more civil rights. Unfortunately for Kennedy, he failed to obtain passage of each of these proposals. In many ways, the American people remembered the style of JFK rather than the substance of his legislative accomplishments. He wasn't the vote gatherer his successor would be. Next, we'll explore some issues surrounding Kennedy's foreign policy, with a particular focus on United States relations with Cuba. We'll begin with some background information concerning CIA undercover operations which took place during the Cold War under President Eisenhower. The first was seen in the early 1950s when the Prime Minister of Iran began to nationalize the nation's oil fields. The CIA believed this might open Iran to Soviet influence. So in 1953, the United States helped support a coup which placed the Shah into power, who was pro-American. In the short run, this gave the Americans an ally in the Middle East and access to cheap oil. However, in the long run, this led to resentment of Americans, which was clearly seen in the 1970s. A second operation took place in Guatemala in 1954. Here, the CIA trained revolutionaries who overthrew Arbenz, the nation's democratically elected leader, due to his ties to communism. The relative success of these undercover operations influenced Kennedy to consider another CIA plan to eliminate a communist leader while he was president. When a communist leader emerged in Cuba in the late 1950s, the CIA came up with another plan to oust this individual. The leader's name was Fidel Castro, and Cuba was located only 90 miles off the shore of Florida. The plan was developed when Eisenhower was in the Oval Office, but authorized by John Kennedy. The series of events were known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion itself took place in April of 1961, and it involved the Americans training and equipping about 1,500 Cuban exiles. They would then invade Cuba, and it was believed that this would spark a general revolution which would lead to the end of Castro's regime in that nation. In April of 1961, they landed at the Bay of Pigs, and it was a complete failure. This was called the Bay of Pigs invasion because on the southern shore of Cuba, where this arrow is pointing, is where the invaders were set to land. That location was named the Bay of Pigs. Overall, the invasion was a complete fiasco and an embarrassment to both Kennedy and the nation. In the long run, it pushed Castro closer to the Soviet Union. However, the United States didn't stop trying to eliminate Castro. The code name for the plan to assassinate the Cuban leader was Operation Mongoose. Tensions increased between the Americans and Soviets in the Cold War following a summit between President Kennedy and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the summer of 1961. The two sparred over the future of the city of Berlin. Tensions eased by August, but by then the Soviets began building a wall to prevent people from leaving eastern Berlin to the west. The Berlin Wall became an important symbol of the Cold War for nearly 30 years. While the Cold War was becoming hotter as the Soviets built the Berlin Wall, the closest the Americans and the Soviets came to nuclear war came in October of 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the fall of that year, it was discovered that nuclear weapons were being installed in Cuba by the Soviet Union. The question facing Kennedy and his advisors was how to eliminate those nuclear weapons. Some called for an invasion of Cuba. Others supported airstrikes. Eventually, a quarantine of Cuba was established. Following the establishment of the quarantine, several Russian ships on their way to Cuba stopped. Nuclear war was only barely avoided. The Soviets agreed to dismantle their nuclear weapons in Cuba. In return, the Americans agreed not to attempt an overthrow of Castro again. The United States also removed nuclear weapons in Turkey. In the short run, it eased tension between the Americans and Soviets as a direct line was established between Washington, D.C. and the Kremlin. But in the long run, both sides built up their nuclear arsenals as they worked to maintain nuclear superiority. Some additional hyperlinks to the Cuban Missile Crisis are below. Next, we will focus on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. In the fall of 1963, Kennedy was preparing for his re-election bid to take place the following year as he and many of his advisors traveled to Texas. As his motorcade drove through the streets of Dallas, 3 shots rang out and the president was hit. He was pronounced dead about an hour later. The nation mourned the fallen president as people were glued to their television sets over the next several days. When accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred to another location, thousands watched as he was gunned down on national television by Dallas resident Jack Ruby. Numerous conspiracy theories abounded, and new President Lyndon Johnson created the Warren Commission to investigate Kennedy's death. For more information about the Kennedy assassination, as well as information about the different conspiracy theories, click on the hyperlink below. Following Kennedy's death, Vice President Johnson assumed the presidency and brought his own style to the White House. Prior to serving as John Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader and a master of procedure in Congress. Once he became President of the United States, he successfully obtained passage of many of his and John Kennedy's proposals. Johnson was famous for using his so-called Johnson treatment to effectively obtain passage of legislation that he supported. He was famous for getting people who were on the fence, so to speak, to come to his point of view. As we see in this picture, he's using his own size to intimidate and pressure someone to change his stance. Johnson was very successful in obtaining the passage of many pieces included in his domestic policy. The first area of Johnson's domestic policy success I'd like to look at would be with civil rights. I'd like to begin with some background. During the first part of Kennedy's administration, in many ways he dragged his feet on the issue of civil rights. However, a shift in Kennedy's policies, as well as public opinion, came about due to the effectiveness of the sit-in movement, as shown with the image here on the left. One of the biggest factors that led to this shift in the American people came with a series of nonviolent protests launched by Martin Luther King Jr. in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. King staged a series of sit-ins and pray-ins in one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Nonviolent protesters were met with attack dogs and fire hoses. TV cameras caught these events, and public opinion began to shift, and finally, JFK acted. Kennedy began to publicly support strong civil rights legislation, however, Congress didn't act before he was killed. Shortly after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson delivered a speech in which he called on members of Congress to pass a new civil rights law in honor of the fallen president. Congress did act, and the result was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. First of all, this outlawed discrimination in all public places, bringing an abrupt end to Jim Crow and segregation laws throughout the nation. Secondly, it outlawed job discrimination based on race and sex. Third, a commission was established to enforce this act, so not only were strong provisions put in place, but there was enforcement power as well. In many ways, this was the strongest civil rights legislation passed in about 100 years. Closely associated with segregation in public places was access to the right to vote. The purple sections of this chart signify the incredibly low numbers of African Americans who were registered to vote prior to 1965. Just look at the state of Mississippi. Only 6% of its black residents were registered to vote. To address this issue of African Americans and the right to vote, Johnson supported and Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This made it illegal to interfere with a person's right to vote. It also suspended literacy tests, which had been used for decades to deny African Americans access to the ballot. This dramatically impacted the numbers of blacks who were registered to vote. In 1964, there were only 1 million registered, but by 1968, over 3 million had registered. Johnson also saw tremendous success with his Great Society program. One thing included was the Economic Opportunity Act, which authorized spending $1 billion for his declared war on poverty. Programs included money for low-income housing, vocational training. It also established Head Start, which enabled disadvantaged preschoolers the opportunity to start kindergarten on equal footing with other students. There was a national health care program for the elderly called Medicare, and one for the poor called Medicaid. Johnson also was able to obtain increased federal funding for public education. Here we see a photograph of Johnson signing the Medicare legislation into law. The Great Society was a high point for liberal reform in U.S. history. Remember that new frontier that I talked about early in this lecture? This was Kennedy's domestic policy. Well, by the late 1960s, where Kennedy had failed, Johnson had been successful. Overall, the Great Society improved many people's lives, as we see poverty rates, infant mortality, and the percentage of blacks living in poverty decreasing dramatically during this era. However, poverty was not eliminated. The Great Society seemed more like a dream than a concrete reality. And by the late 1960s, even Johnson himself was distracted by American involvement in the Vietnam War. Now we can address some issues associated with the Civil Rights Movement, Phase 2. from 1963 onward. In many ways, 1963 was a turning point in American history. John Kennedy was assassinated in that year. Soon thereafter, the United States also made a deeper commitment to the war in Vietnam, and we see an expansion in the civil rights movement. Black Power emerged as an alternative to Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent tactics. Hispanics, Native Americans, and women also became more visibly involved in the civil rights movement. One important leader of the Black Power movement was Malcolm X, who was a member of the Nation of Islam. He was popular among many African Americans living in the North and in inner cities. His goal was to urge blacks to have pride in their African heritage, and he called upon blacks to separate from what he called the white devil. His tactic was to use any means necessary, and he rejected Martin Luther King Jr.'s view of nonviolent protest. At one point, he even described King as an Uncle Tom. Malcolm then changed his stance and even hinted at reconciliation with King following his break with the Nation of Islam after a trip to Mecca. However, an assassin's bullet ended his life. The publication of his autobiography eventually became an anthem for the Black Power movement. Black Power was also seen with the boxer Cassius Clay. After winning the heavyweight crown in 1964, Clay announced his conversion to the Nation of Islam in his new name, Muhammad Ali. The Black Panthers, founded in 1966, was another organization associated with Black Power. Results of the movement were difficult to quantify, but widespread. Many black studies programs were established in colleges during the 1960s. Black activists encouraged members of the African American community to vote, which increased the numbers of elected officials who were black. Finally, we see greater racial pride and self-esteem among African Americans with the mantra, "Black is beautiful." Hispanics were also involved in the civil rights movement. They constituted the fastest-growing racial minority group following World War II. However, many lived in poverty and came from rural areas with little access to education. As a result, many adults never learned to read very well. Cesar Chavez became a leader in the Hispanic community. Chavez was born on a farm in Arizona and worked as a migrant farm worker for many years. During World War II, he served in the Navy. His goal was to provide economic opportunity to Hispanics. His tactics were nonviolent. He wanted to create a union. He also urged consumers to boycott products until working conditions improved. Overall, he succeeded in gaining recognition of his United Farm Workers Union and had a big impact on improving economic conditions faced by Hispanics in the United States. Native Americans also fought for their rights. By the 1960s, American Indians had the highest poverty rates, highest death rates, and disease rates, as well as the least education out of any group in the country. And no one seemed to know this. In 1968, an aggressive Indian group was co-founded by Dennis Banks and George Mitchell. The name of this organization was AIM, or the American Indian Movement. Its goals were to publicize problems facing Native Americans and reawaken interest in Indian culture and heritage nationwide. Their tactic was to use the court system to reassert treaty rights. They gained national attention with a series of fish-ins in Washington state in an attempt to reestablish fishing rights there. They also occupied Alcatraz Island in 1969, citing an old treaty which asserted that unused federal lands should return to Indian control. We also see a rejuvenated women's movement during this era. In 1963, President Kennedy established a commission on the status of women. It reported, among other things, that women faced discrimination in many aspects of their lives. It also argued that women did not receive equal pay for equal work as compared to their male counterparts. In response to this, in 1966, several women formed NOW, or the National Organization for Women. Betty Friedan was one of the more famous founders of NOW because of the publication of her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, which influenced many women of this era. The goal of NOW was to seek more equality for women. Their tactic was to influence the government to legislate more equality. One issue associated with women's rights during this era was the Equal Rights Amendment. ERA was passed by Congress in 1972. This would have amended the Constitution to prohibit discrimination based on sex. In order for the amendment to become part of the Constitution, it required a 3/4 majority vote among the state legislatures. Unfortunately for supporters for this amendment, there wasn't enough support for the amendment's ratification. Several ideas have been addressed in this lecture. We can now review some of the most important concepts raised. Well, this lecture addressed many of the issues associated with President Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson during their administrations. It also covered the Civil Rights Movement, Phase 2. Maybe there are two things that you'd like to evaluate as you think about the information from this lecture. First of all, do you think the liberal reform movement associated with Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society was good or bad for the United States? Also, which accomplishment during the Civil Rights Movement do you believe to be most important? Well, that's all for this topic today. The next few slides will offer hyperlinks to additional information as well as sources for this lecture. Have a great day, and I hope you learned something new.